Hi there. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. And I'm happy to welcome you to today's Berkeley Book Chat. Berkeley Book Chats series features a Berkeley faculty member in the arts and humanities community discussing recently published work. Today, our guest is Professor Eric Falci of the Department of English, talking about his book, The Value of Poetry. Eric will be joined by Polina Barskova of the Slavic Languages and Literatures Department and Hejinian of the English Department. Before we go any further, though, let me announce a couple of things that are upcoming in the Townsend Center. Tomorrow at noon, we will be co-hosting a program called Music, Diaspora, and the World, which is a conversation with Angelique Kidjo, the great African-based musician, who will be in conversation with Victoria Grubbs of the Black Studies Collaboratory, Ivy Mills of the Department of Art History, and Tiana Pascal of the Department of Sociology and African American Studies. That will take place in room 820 in the Social Sciences building, in the Social Sciences Matrix. That's at the top of the building that used to be called Barrows Hall, but it will also be online. So I hope you'll join us for this extraordinary conversation with Angelique Kidjo. Next week at the same time and same place, we'll be featuring another Berkeley Book Chat. We'll have Dora Zhang of the Department of English and Comparative Literature talking about her new book called Strange Likeness, Description, and the Modernist Novel. So for today's event now, our guests will speak for around 3/4 of an hour and then take questions. So I encourage you to type your questions into your chat functions as we go, and we will try to get to them toward the end of the hour. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn things over now to Eric, Lynn, and Polina. Welcome all three of you to the Townsend Center.
Thank you. I guess I'm the first interlocutor, and I should begin by saying a few words about The Value of Poetry, the book we are chatting about today. The book asks the simple but very capacious question, what is being valued in a poem? What is a poet finding valuable to do? And what is getting valued by the poem? What perhaps social or political or environmental or subjective or aesthetic or philosophical or material things is it finding valuable to think and speak about or with? Eric Falci does not attempt in the book to identify any attribute or attributes as the one or ones that secure value for poetry at some universal level. This isn't a universalist inquiry, nor a polemical defense or espousal of an aesthetic program. What the book considers are values that are specific to individual poems or sets of poems and local to their context. It thinks about the ways that poems are situated in relation to the worlds they reflect and perhaps influence. Even as the value of poetry doesn't attempt to establish universal values, and perhaps doesn't believe that such values even can exist, it also doesn't set about offering an evaluative system, nor does it try to provide a guide to evaluation or aesthetic judgment. It's not interested in establishing criteria for distinguishing good poetry from bad poetry. Rather, it examines the ways in which poems and their poets deploy values that are intrinsic to poetry, while taking into account the fact that the term poetry can include a vast amount of writing and a plethora of styles and structures. At the end of the volume, there's a richly detailed index, and even a quick look at it shows the range of writers whose work receives attention in The Value of Poetry. Here, for example, are the names just of the poets included in the B, under the letter B. Let me just get to B here. Hugo Ball, Mary Jo Bang, Amiri Baraka, Charles Baudelaire, Caroline Bergvall, Charles Bernstein, Ted Berrigan, Wendell Berry, John Berryman, Elizabeth Bishop, Christian Book, Jorge Luis Borges, Robert Bridges, Gwendolyn Brooks, Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning, and John Burnside. As this list suggests, Eric's attention and erudition are capacious and free of adherence to schools, fads, or trends. Simply, he reads a lot and he reads well. The book has a substantive introduction and equally substantive conclusion, one focus of which is ecopoetics and poetry's relationships to large natural systems. And between those are 4 chapters, each offering a view of poetic value, value making, and value exercising from a different perspective. They are in order: chapter 1, attention and play; chapter 2, worlds and selves; chapter 3, feeling, thought; chapter 4, recollection. Polina, Barskova's, and my questions for Eric will attempt to touch on values relevant to those areas. But at Eric's request, we hope the conversation that ensues is about poetry at least as much as it is about the book. Along the way, as Timothy Hampton has said, please feel free to type a question for Eric into the chat space. We'll leave around 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end of our conversation. And so, with the first chapter of the book in mind, attention and play, let me begin by asking a question about the value of making, or poiesis, the activity in which a person brings something into being that did not exist before. I'm wondering in particular about the ways in which you, Eric, might think about form, or perhaps shape, in relation to making a poem, and the ways in which forming invites or requires attention and play, not only on the part of the poet, but also perhaps on the part of the reader. So go for it.
Thank you so much, Lynn. First, let me just quickly thank both Lynn and Polina for being a part of this conversation and for taking the time to be a part of this in the middle of a very busy, complicated semester. And also, of course, thank you to Tim Hampton and Rebecca and Eric and everyone at the Townsend Center for inviting me in the first place. The Townsend Center is just such a wonderful spot and resource on campus. It's really a gem at Berkeley, and I'm really honored to be a part of this fall's schedule. So I guess in terms of making, I guess, it's interesting. The book, I kind of get a little, I don't know, prickly, I guess, in the beginning of the book, because I was really interested in writing a book that was about poems, right? That was the only way that I could think of myself as fulfilling the brief of, writing a book called The Value of Poetry. Like, I obviously couldn't and had no interest in writing a book that made an argument about poets, right? A Shelleyan romantic argument about there being, the unacknowledged legislators of the world, or a Platonic argument about the danger that they presented to the polis, or anything like that. And so that, when I kind of found my way into kind of writing this book, I really focused on I wanted to focus more on poems than on poetry as some sort of abstraction, or on poets, right, poets as having a particular kind of vocation, and so in certain ways, like, I think some of the premises that I began with set that question of kind of making aside, right, not explicitly but implicitly. But I found myself, I think, you're right, Lynn, it's a part of the book all the time, right, in the sense that so much of the interest of many of the poems that I talk about in the book are, have to do with some interpretation of, or understanding of, or even just some speculation about how the thing was made, right? And there's some really interestingly made poems like that I look at. One poem by Carolyn Bergvall called Via is essentially an act of copying, right? That the making of that poem is achieved, and Bergvall set out at the start and intended to do this, of finding every single translation into English of the Inferno, of Dante's The Inferno, and copying its opening tercet, right? And then placing all of those opening tercets in alphabetical order. right? And that's the poem. And so, in certain ways, if I describe that, if I say that this is what the poem is made out of, it's a bunch of repetitions of various translations of the same 3 lines again and again and again and again, you might not think that'll be a very interesting poem. But what became really clear is that, one, it ends up being a kind of remarkably interesting poem. And two, the way that Bergvall describes the making of the poem and what was involved with making of the making of the poem and making the poem, which meant things like going to each of these going to the British Library again and again and again and again, finding these various English language translation of Dante, copying carefully those 3 lines, arranging, collating, checking, rechecking, all the things that we tend to kind of opposed to something like creative writing, right? Just those seemingly mechanical tasks of copying, double checking one's work, things like that. That becomes the real, ethical, aesthetic, and even political interest of the poem, and it's remarkably fascinating. And so I think, Lynn, to sort of pull, it ended up being that I ended up thinking about making a lot in this book, not only sort of why in this late day would someone make a poem or would someone write a poem, but how would they go about doing so when, on the one hand, it seems like everything's available, right? It seems, if we just looked at, one of the things that's interesting to me about contemporary poetry, as I write in the beginning of the book, it's called The Value of Poetry, and kind of pitches itself in this kind of huge way, but obviously the book is much more limited. Like, I write from the perspective that I can write about. I mostly write about poetry in English. I made a decision to write mostly about, although not entirely about, kind of contemporary poetry. So it is obviously more limited. But if we just look at contemporary poetry, just sort of what's possible in terms of a strategy or practice of making a poem or a book of poems or a series of poems or whatever is just remarkable. What's interesting is that, and not that there wasn't in past times just as much or more possibility, but it gets to the point where one of the interesting questions is less about that point that you made earlier, Lynn, about, that the book doesn't kind of adjudicate between so-called good poetry and so-called bad poetry, however we might want to do that if we wanted to do that. But one of the questions that comes up almost kind of in lieu of that question, not both in the book and just generally, is sort of what counts as a poem, right? Or what is someone willing to count as a poem, right? How many. And just to give one, quick example, many of the poems that I look at in the book are in prose, are in various kinds of prose, whether kind of paragraph-like shapes on the page, strophe or line-like shapes in the page that don't seem to be in kind of versed, any kind of lineated structure. And so I think, because there's so many possibilities for the starting point of making a poem, it tends to be, it's a tremendously exciting kind of place to kind of think about things, but also a pretty harrowing one too, because what I found, what seems to be interesting is sort of that question of how, because I'm always trying to think even if I don't adjudicate in the book, this is a good poem, this is a bad poem, or so, and that's not part of what the book does, but clearly the fact of I choose to talk about certain poems, and in doing so exclude many, many other poems. And so there's some value judging going on there. And because the poems are so different, right? One is a pretty, one poem in chapter 1 is a pretty standard lyric poem of a recognizable sort. Another poem in chapter 4 is that Bergvall poem that I talked about, which is essentially a kind of highly wrought found poem. Another poem in the conclusion is a kind of a digital poem that that is kind of unreadable in any kind of human sense. It becomes a little strange even thinking to oneself, by what criteria am I deciding to myself that this is good, if only good in the sense that I want to write about it, right? Or that I want to include it in the book. And so one of the, to come back to that question of making, I think that it ends up, maybe, and Lynn, I don't know, and Polina, maybe the question, 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 maybe the question we should just, I should toss it back to you. I mean, there's some aspects of making that seem predetermined, or at least pre-thought, right? Like it does seem like a number of poets have a thought like, okay, this poem is going to be about this long, right? I mean, there's plenty of poems that are in 25 19-line stanzas or something. That's just not that's not an accident. I mean, obviously that's intended. And so coupled with that sense of kind of some aspects of the making process being predetermined or pre-thought, is that kind of process of kind of revelation and discovery that happens as the poem is being written, right? Where a poem that one thinks of as was going to be a short little poem on a nice little topic ends up just kind of keeping going in a sense, and kind of ends up generating an entirely new structure. And so I think it's an interesting kind of dialectic or kind of alternation between those two kind of thoughts about making, like the sense that I'm going to make a thing, and the thing I'm going to make is going to be about this big and kind of this shape, maybe, and that's going to deal with these kinds of questions. And then that other kind of subterranean kind of tug that keeps happening with every line and with every syllable and with every phrase that rewrites or torques that kind of initial intention, whatever it might have been, right? So, I mean, I don't know. What do you? I mean, is that kind of get at some of what was going on in your question, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, very much. I mean, I think the elephant in the room here is the fact that all three of us, Polina, you, Eric, and me, are poets, and like in addition to our other academic pursuits. So I think we all have experienced firsthand in the question of what's the form.
Yeah.
And why is it going to be that form rather than another form?
I guess
what do you think, Polina?
Wow. I think one of the most interesting things that comes from Eric's book is that radical multiplicity of what we see today as a poem that happens, the process of not just making, but madeness. And I guess for me, right, as you read the poet starting from B, from madeness and the product of Baudelaire to digital poems, as you've mentioned, there is certain shock value for me. And that was one of my most favorite things that I found in this volume, that to the question, what is a poem? What's been made here? There are so many answers. And I am still kind of dealing with what's offered in this volume, because I come not only from a much more conservative tradition, being Russian poetry, but also a tradition today in the process of radical reinvention, often in conversation with the English language. So I think this conversation is what is being made. It's an important and a difficult one. That's why for me it was so interesting to see how Eric can look at such different versions of the poem product and judge it from what this particular text gives you. I think, yes, kind of this crazy, radical, difficult diversity is for me one of the most interesting findings of this book.
I love the way you put that, sort of what is being made here, right? Like, I mean that, because sometimes it's even the idea of something being made. Even to think about poetry in those terms is a little strange, because poetry is granted this kind of. I mean, one of the things that I read about in the book a little bit is is like the weird materiality, the weird kind of conceptualization of materiality in when we think about poetry. Like, you know, we think about poetry, we grant poets often as a kind of objecthood, right? Like, you know, and I the two famous quotes that I give in one of the chapters is, you know, Cleanth Brooks, the well-wrought urn, right? And William Carlos Williams, A Machine Made of Words, right? And so poetry is given this kind of objecthood, right? Like it's like it gets made, like a sculptor sculpts stone, or a painter makes a painting, like it's an actual thing in the world. And yet, of course, it's not quite a thing in the world, right? And but it's not exactly the same as a kind of a piece of music or a piece of composed music, you know, composed music where, you know, if you handed someone the score to a Beethoven symphony and said, see, you've now heard the Beethoven symphony, no one would think that they had, right? Because what's required, obviously, is the performance of that thing. Poetry is not entirely like that, but it's kind of in this middle ground between the object, you know, the painting, or, you know, the object art, you know, forms of art that have an object, right? And the kind of time-based forms like music or dance. I mean, poetry weirdly like straddles, and it's just like splayed across those two modes, right? And so, and even that question of kind of, you know, making is vexed within that, right? Because poems are a thing that someone makes, but also it's the act of, I mean, so much poetry in the 20th century especially has prioritized process over, you know, the well-wrought urn, has prioritized, and you know, however we might want to think about that in terms of kind of a serial structure, or in terms of kind of, you know, essential to the poem is the operations that made it, you know, whether that's a kind of you know, this book of poetry is a book of poetry because I decided to write X number of lines each day, and you know what, you know, if the kind of if the act of making it is part of the thing that's made, right, that's become a really important part of poetry for, you know, 100 years, you know, a really long time now. And so even that question of kind of what is a poem, right, in terms of a made thing, a performance of a made thing, a kind of a compositional performance a compositional activity that we're just seeing the kind of after image of in some sense. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, I don't know, but it's a really interesting way of thinking about Polina, especially, you know, coming from you know, thinking about it against a kind of a tradition of Russian poetry, right, which has you know, so many different investments and has unfolded in such a different way, right? Sorry, Lynn, did you want to add, or Polina?
Well, no, I was just thinking about the Soviet and then Russian poet Arkady Dragomoshenko, who he died a few years ago, and is now considered to be one of the great Russian poets of the 20th or late second half of the 20th century. But I remember being at a reading that he gave in then Leningrad, at which somebody shouted suddenly, "This isn't poetry, this isn't poetry," and stomped out. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to know like what's going to be deemed to be really poetry at what a given moment, and then not prior to that moment.
I mean, do you think, I mean, and part of me, or part of the narrative, and I don't know if I fully think it or agree with it, but, you know, part of the narrative, at least of kind of an Anglo-American poetics of the last, I don't know, 40 years or something, is that there's this kind of radical democratization of all styles, right? So that, you know, even as the kind of camps and factions of poetry remain intact or shifting, there's this sense in which there's just kind of this porousness, right, between styles. So, you know, that the old, you know, the old like chestnut, you know, mainstream, or what does Bernstein call it, the official verse culture.
Official verse culture,
Yeah, so like the official verse culture and the avant-garde on the one side, like on the one hand, like we know that doesn't hold if it ever did, but we still like rely on it as a shorthand all the time. And it's, I mean, do you think that there is this? I mean, I guess like I would think maybe in a totally different way. Like a number of the poems, some of the poems that I look at in this book I don't know if any of them actually were, but could easily have been poems in the New Yorker, right? Like Seamus Heaney's Requiem for the Crappies, which I talk about a little bit in the book, wasn't published in the New Yorker, but like it could have been, right? Whereas a number of the poems that I talk about in the book, I can't imagine that they would even be kind of legible to whoever was judging, deciding on which poems go in the New Yorker as poetry. Not even sort of as good or bad or worthwhile, but sort of as poetry. And so I guess there isn't as much kind of just anything goes as we sometimes maybe tend to kind of think or tell ourselves. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, just my first submissions as a poet were when I was 14 and I submitted some poems to the New Yorker where they did not appear. I have never been published in the New Yorker. But I think actually, like with changing editorship or poetry editorship at the New Yorker, I think that the profile of poetry has changed.
Yeah,
a
fair
great
enough.
deal.
Fair
Yeah.
enough. Yeah.
So the New Yorker is not necessarily the standard of official verse culture.
Yeah. Or is there even a standard, right? Like, where would, if we wanted to kind of point to an object that approximated official verse culture, whether a person or a venue or a whatever, it's hard to know what we would point at. That's part of the interesting kind of muck of contemporary poetry cultures, is that, it isn't just like everything's possible and everyone reads everything equally happily, but there is some sense in which maybe that there's just much more movement across the whole field than there was. But I think that's a pretty presentist thing for me to say, because I'm sure if we went back to the 1920s and looked, we would be able to make a similar claim.
I wanted to ask a question about value of poetry in time. Reading the portion of your book that speaks to the problem of the elegiac, I decided that I really would like to hear your opinion. What poetries you've been looking at, how it's working with the task of mourning for, let's say, the momentum during which you've been writing this book. Because one of the things I've been asking myself when reading your book and reacting to your book and loving your book and disagreeing with your book is like, I don't think I necessarily want to talk about value of poetry without thinking how it's connected to its time. So this is my question. What is poetry doing and has been doing for the last years, when it seems that one of the most urgent tasks is again to cry?
Yeah, I think you're right. And that was one of the questions that I really had kind of writing the whole time writing, and one of my real hesitations would be writing the book in the first place. Like, why would I, there's other stuff to be getting on with rather than the value of poetry, right? I think I guess I'd say, and I guess I talk most about this in the kind of the conclusion chapter where I really talk more about poetry in kind of a moment of kind of ecological catastrophe. The book was written and published pre-COVID, or I guess it came out at the end of 2020, so it appeared in COVID, but it takes no cognizance. It doesn't know, the book doesn't know that COVID is happening, if that makes sense. But I mean, I think on the one hand, poetry is really poorly suited for some of the tasks that we need, right? In terms of, and by which I mean, like, compared to other forms of discourse or other forms of communication or other kinds of language, it's not well suited to that. Or at least the kind of poetry that I tend to kind of focus on in the book, poetry that's layered and knotty and complex and all that business. That's sometimes, that's not what's needed in discussions about, say, climate change, right? We need to do stuff, right? And the kind of nuanced, subtle filigree that a poem can put together is pretty useless in that kind of thing. And so on the one hand, I think I side with Auden a little bit, right? Or what Auden said still makes sense, right? Like, poetry doesn't make anything happen, and poetry is not going to save in that sense. I do think that one of both the kind of temptations and I don't know if it's a danger, but temptation. I mean, I get one of the temptations of poetry, and temptation being both balancing both ways, is that in certain ways, all poetry becomes elegiac. All poetry now, or nearly all poetry now, becomes elegiac, because it's almost like writing with the knowledge of some sense of the end, right? If poetry kind of imagines itself as projecting into a future, and who knows how long that future, I mean, Shakespeare obviously projects the sonnets into the future directly, often in the poems. But this idea, if the idea of the future is kind of tenuous now, or gone, right? If in terms of human culture, human civilization, then poetry almost can't. One of poetry's probably go-to stances is a kind of proleptic mourning, right? For that which is not lost now, but already lost, if that makes sense. And I think that's but that's not all. I mean, if poetry just did that, then it would be just kind of not sufficient either, right? Because we don't need just continual lamentations of our state. We need something else. I mean, I think, one of the things that I think poetry can do, and it kind of comes back to your question about time, but from a different angle, poetry is able to kind of play with time and notions of time in a way that I think is, I won't say unique, but really, really interesting in a lot of ways. And poetry, because it's sort of premised on often the small scale of the lyric eye, let's say, or that kind of small, poems don't unfold huge worlds like novels do, or Marvel movies do. Like they operate often in a kind of in a more intimate scale, and which is not to say like a personal scale or just kind of something, but an intimate scale. But they have this weird ability to kind of scale up and scale down, because the intimacy of that scale can go big at any moment. By which I mean, like those kind of core engines of poetry, pronouns like you and I and here and there and then and now, end up doing quite specific work in the act of writing and reading, right? Like when someone reads a poem and encounters the word now, it can't but mean a little bit the now of reading, right? But it also kind of is a whole bunch of other nows, right? That's happening, that happened or will happen in the future. And so I think there's this sense in which poetry is able to kind of compound and kind of or present kind of alternate modalities of time or experiencing of time that at least helps us begin to kind of point at one of the kind of the conditions, I guess, of climate change for us now is, it isn't as though the effects of climate change are going to be felt entirely tomorrow, right? I mean, they are going to unfold over on much longer timescales, but thinking those longer timescales as a single human brain and a single human body who's mortal and has X number of years left, it's so difficult to even kind of think on those timescales, right? To kind of imagine what they would be like. And some of the poems that I look at in the last chapter kind of try to kind of project, what would it be like to kind of think at this kind of inhuman timescale within the very human space of a poem. So maybe that's one way that it can get out of the kind of rut of only elegizing, right? I mean, in certain ways, like it's all poems might be a certain kind of elegy, at this moment, but I don't know, Lynn or Polina, I mean, is that a satisfact? Does that get at some of the question?
Absolutely. I like the idea of getting out of the rut of elegizing.
I think my thought in response to what you said, Eric, is that the now is also always a here and a there, which is to say that I mean, thinking about climate change, we're talking about spaces, places, physical, atmospheric, etc. And thinking about the diaspora, the wars that are going on, the immigrants that are trying, the economic war, gender wars even, that are sending people across borders or desperately in flight from where they were born or find themselves living. Those are all now occasions. Like now I live in my house. Now I'm trudging northward to the hostile border between Mexico and the United States, which are also theirs. So I think that's, in play. And I'm thinking, it interests me, Polina, what you said about the sort of proliferation of modes, styles, discourses, and topics, I would think, that are unfolding in Russian poetry now. And the interest in English language or maybe English poetry even, as a kind of, maybe we cannot speak to the future, but maybe we can speak across borders. And often be misunderstood across borders, obviously, which I find particularly exciting because I know that when I first started going to the Soviet Union, a number of the Soviet poets were reading books that had been left behind by poetry books that had been left behind by tourists, and so there was no sense of the context in which they were written. So like people thought that Allen Ginsberg and Mark Strand, very, very, very different American poets from the mid to late 20th century, were kind of in the same school and the same aesthetics. And then they were, some of the Russian poets were like learning from this school, which was not a school, of course, at all. Just a coincidence that the two books happened to be left in, X hotel and put on the black market by whoever got them out of the rooms or of the hotel.
I ran here, so to say, speaking of now our different understanding of space and movement, from the discussion of a new big project of Russian poetry and American poetry working together. So this is still happening. But since we have little bit time before, hopefully questions might arrive from our listeners. Another thing I wanted to point out and to ask of Eric, this book speaks a lot to the phenomenology of sound and what poetry today that you find in your zone of curiosity, excitement, what this poetry wants with sound, wants of sound. I just wanted to ask you, how would you present to your reader, to our audience, to us, what are the most important things that poetry that you've been looking at wants from sound today?
Wow, that's a great question, and
Really
a
a great
really hard one. Then chime in whenever you want. I mean, I think
I just think it's a great question.
it's a great question. I mean, on the one hand, I'd say that, you know, one of the things that poetry is or that poems are often interested in doing is kind of you know, poems are, you know, poetry is just always complicit, right? In the sense that it is made out of the exact same stuff as, you know, political advertisements and newspapers and daily conversation and, you know, language, right? And so I think one of the things that is often at stake in a poem or at a moment of a poem is a certain kind of, you know, a kind of what, you know, a very familiar kind of notion from Russian formalism of defamiliarization or estrangement, right? So I think that's at work. And I think that often happens via kind of sound patternings, right? And so it isn't just a matter of you know, trying to like form newfangled forms of automatopoeia, right? But rather a kind of an attempt to kind of set up an alternate kind of logic or structure within a text that runs through notions of sound, right? You know, how, you know, the kind of development of sound through the poem, rather than one, you know, based on, you know, logic or the kind of the standard moves of an exposition or an argument or something like that. What poems, I mean, so I think in certain sense, there's a kind of pleasure in phrase. I mean, you know, from the maker side and from also the reader side, you know, there's a kind of the great pleasure of phrase making using that thing that we all have, language, right? You know, and so I think that that's one thing that both poets and say readers of poetry, I would imagine, want from sound, right? The sort of that sense in which you know, words are kind of bound together in some sort of new way, based not on their, you know, proximity in terms of meaning or etymology, but in terms of some aspect of their sonic properties that opens up a new dimension of each of them or both of them. So, I mean, you know, I don't, God, that's a huge, but we could talk about that question. I think we could go on for days. I mean, there's so many aspects to it, right? There's the sound and the question of performance, right? Like bodies perform it, you know, speaking the poem, and what's the difference between like the authorial reading, which is typically the reading that we have, right? Like, you know, I mean, it's interesting, like, you know, there isn't a culture of covers in poetry now, you know, like we don't go to a Lynn Hejinian reading where Lynn Hejinian reads William Blake poems the whole time, although that'd be kind of fun, you know. So we kind of attach the authorial body or the authorial voice to the authorial body reading it, and kind of grant that reading in sound, in time, in space, a certain kind of, I don't know, something, if not authority, then a certain kind of status. So there's that whole performative dimension of sound, and we could go into spoken word. There's a whole line of answers that would go down that way. There's a whole line that would kind of think about sound as an imagined aspect of poems in the way, you know, for lack of a better word, what I'll call like diegetic sound. Like, what sounds do poems make for us to hear, not just in the kind of assonance, consonance, alliteration, rhyme, that kind of thing, but like what soundscapes do poems generate, right? Within themselves, and do they do that sort of thing? Do they create scenes, you know, scenes of listening in that sort of sense? And you know, and that other, which I guess is the kind of takes us back to like the kind of very familiar romantic Mill, Wordsworthian notion of poetry as being kind of you know, the voice overheard, right? And so I think that's another way that kind of sound as the kind of as indicating kind of human voice and human proximity. That I think would be another way to answer that. But boy, that's a huge and wonderful question. I don't know. I mean, and there's obviously 10 other directions that I didn't even mention. Did you have a particular, like, were you thinking about it in terms of kind of a political, was there a kind of a political or spatial dimension you were thinking about it, or the play of sound within poems, or the sounds that poems, did you have any?
Not necessarily political, but I think rather in connection to Lynn's first question, to what extent sounding is connected to making, which for me, for example, is somewhat urgent.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess like, poets trusting those other aspects of the linguistic object, words and things, not simply their dictionary meaning, but their sound patterns, and letting that do the work of constructing or developing a poem, trusting. I think I would imagine that like lots of poets have that moment when they hit upon some interesting combination of words that sound like they need to be together, but don't mean anything that would necessarily put them together as a kind of as a moment to be trusted. I don't know, maybe a moment to be trusted, or although I can imagine it going the exact opposite way, that like it becomes a kind of another form of like poetry's deceptions, right? Like that. That in I don't know, like that in lieu of rational argument, we get kind of sound effects that chime on a superficial level and make us go along or something like that. I mean, I can imagine that, in the way that like political, slogans, right? Like the famous "I like Ike" example from Jakobsen, right? Like, what the power of that, according to Jakobsen, is the kind of the sonic binding that happens. It's not a poem, but it has designs on us, right? Like to vote for Eisenhower, but I like to think that the poems that I tend to value don't do that kind of compulsion of the political slogan, but do that kind of sonic binding without the kind of without trying to sell one something, but
you talk about like trusting the poem, or trusting the sound, but I in my experience, one has to like trust the language, like you get going, and I think one of the things that triggers a phrase is the previous phrase, and often that can be like, for example, like a vowel sound, like the long I of "I like Ike," and then just one could conceivably end up with a poem, which is really a celebration of the long I in English,
right?
And that you didn't know what you were going to write. You started with, my eye is on the rise, and then suddenly you've got a long I in play, like this kind, and this kind, and the letter I, and you're really going, and then you end up with a poem, maybe. I don't know.
And I think it's that kind of exact pressure, multiple forms of pressure on the same sound I, right? Like whether it's EYE, I, or a sound within a word, like it's that kind of like bringing to bear kind of multiple forms of pressure back onto the word that interests me about poetry, right? I mean, and there's this kind of Steinian trajectory here, right? Where, it isn't that she's repeating with variations a string of words, it's that every instance of that kind of remakes the word, the phrase, whatever it is, anew again, in a way, like the famous "Rose is a rose is a rose." What she said about that, that there was never, there was never a rose.
It never has a rose appeared so vividly. I mean, that's the,
and it has nothing. There's no description of a rose. It's simply the word itself, which is opened up in a whole new way.
So I think we should shift to the Q&A mode. Interestingly, the three questions that we have right already to throw at you. I'm not sure we'll have time for all three of them. But I'm going to pick one of them that is going to force you to, or let us think about another aspect here. Okay, the question is, you say that poetry as filigree is not needed in the time of climate change, but wait a minute, but doesn't poetry do the work of helping us dispel the fog of lies and linguistic abuse that keeps us from acting?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess, like, when I said the poet, we don't need the filigree, or that's not sufficient, right? Like, but it's sufficient to poetry, but of course, it's not sufficient to solving climate change, of course. But I think that's right. Like, one of the things that, because poems are inevitably in the same pit as what this question calls the kind of lies and whatever it is, the misinformation, lies, information of political political speech and political discourse. Poetry is made out of the same stuff. It's made out of words, right? And so it's in certain senses, its charge or its prerogative or its opportunity is to kind of unmake and remake from the inside those dangerous kind of crystallizations and instrumentalizations of language that are being used in the service of deception and lies and so on, right? And so what poetry can do, with all of the detail and filigree that it can muster, and whatever other it wants to do, it can kind of break apart in certain senses those words or phrases or terms or notions or ideas that seem kind of dangerously calcified by one group or another group, or for one reason or for another reason. And if nothing, and the other side of this, right, is that, like, what poems force us to do, no, not force is the wrong word. What poems kind of ask us to do, right, is attend to them closely, but not instrumentally, right? Like, oftentimes one wants to attend to things closely and instrumentally. If you're on the subway and there's an announcement overhead telling you information, you want to attend closely and instrumentally, right? You don't want to kind of notice how the mellifluous quality of the consonants as they roll off the subway speakers, whatever. You want to get to the point very quickly. But instrumentality, right, is dangerous and coercive as well. And I think that what poems ask is for or what they provide is this kind of open space of attention, right? Where they ask us to attend closely to made language, right? Which is something that's different from our usual, like, ways of going through. Like, I mean, when we scroll on Twitter, I don't want to overgeneralize something, but we don't read Twitter tweets as we might attend to a poem, if that makes sense, right? Poems ask something different from us. And I think that, to go back to the question, right, like, that's crucial. That's as crucial, that kind of form of attention and form of kind of care with language and thinking about language, setting up this kind of space of possible ethical relation, though perhaps identification or something like that, is part of what poetry can do to, in a general way, kind of help, right? Even if, like I said before, it's, Auden, the Auden phrase, poetry makes nothing happen, is probably, in a kind of narrow sense, true. But yeah, I think that's right. Like, poetry can work against those and unmake those kind of calcifications, those dangerous calcifications of language that we seem to be awash in everywhere, right? We just got to make sure that people read poetry.
Yeah, I agree with that. Here's another question that shifts, not so much, shifts can help us think not just about what poetry is doing, but how the things we use to write, create, make poems influences the way the poems are. So the question is, could you say something about media? How does the change in media, even in a sense, the appearance of the typewriter, change the value of poetry?
I mean, I think, that whether the typewriter or the word processing program on a computer or the poem, poems written on a mobile phone that provides a different kind of sense of space and things like that. I think at the best they can create new formal possibilities, right? It isn't that something is being lost but that new things become that the new, I'll call them just technologies, right? Make for certain poets become generative kind of formal engines, right? Like Olson with the typewriter, he was convinced, that the typewriter wasn't simply a kind of a neutral instrument by which he could get poems onto a page, but that typewriter actually could reformulate what we thought that poems would or could do, right? There's so many interesting things to say about media or the medium. I mean, if only also because, when we think about kind of the, digital questions, right? Like in certain ways, like a digitally born poem can't exist anywhere. I mean, I can't print out the true digital poem is kind of digitally born. And so it almost requires a kind of new set of abilities from readers, right? Like, we don't think about poetry readers as having to be kind of fluent in various kinds of programming languages. And yet we have lots of really interesting writers doing fascinating things with kind of code as poetry, right? And so there's a kind of now lag between kind of, I guess as there always is, between kind of the readers who are able, who have the kind of various skills. I mean, I certainly can't read many of the kind of cutting edge or poetries that are maybe happening within the digital space. But I think at the best, like these become ways of pushing the formal possibilities, which are also the aesthetic and philosophical possibilities of poetry more generally, rather than being a sense of loss because we don't write longhand, or we don't write on typewriters, or we don't or we speak a poem into the it makes new forms of orality and textuality possible, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I would think that one of the benefits, one of the benefits of things like digital poetry is just like going back to the topic that we began with, the making, is that there, and maybe there's a powerful political aspect to this, which is the value of making, and that, like, whether it's a good poem or a bad poem, someone has been making. And I think that activity of making is actually, it can lead people to be thinking in creative, constructive, benevolent ways, and intervening in all the disasters that are happening, because they're busily making in a beautiful way.
I think that's right. I think that's wonderful.
I didn't mean to have the last word, but it's 1 p.m. and I've been told that we have to end at 1 p.m.
I think you should get the last word.
No way. So I won't say another word except thank you very much, Eric, for a wonderful chat, and thank you, Polina. Let's have more chats.
Thank you so much to both of you.
And I just want to say thank you so much for the chance to read this book.
Thanks so much for reading it.
It's been kind of a wonderful, difficult encounter. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you both so much. It's been a real pleasure to kind of just chat about poetry.